thanks to Taylor and Brendan, our colleagues here at the Gund Institute, and all those other people for enabling me to come to Vermont for this week. I'm having a really lovely time, and I'm learning a lot. And thank you very much for inviting me into your bar. I'm a conservation scientist. That means I spend my time working on how best to safeguard the future of wild species and wild places and maintain the benefits that they provide for all of us. And I'm interested, together with several of my colleagues you can see here, in particular in this question of how we're going to manage in future to feed our own species while at the same time leaving some space on the planet for the other 5 or 10 million species that live here. So I want to say just a bit to open this, some controversial thoughts perhaps about what we've found when we've been trying to answer the question of how to feed the planet without eating it. First, why is there a problem? Well, we know that while food production has been increasing over the past 50 years, it's more than managed to keep pace with human population growth, and that's a really marvelous and very important thing. We know that it's also done so at enormous cost to the non-human environment. So just some numbers. Farming now covers over half of all agriculturally usable land. It's more than doubled nitrogen fixation rates. Through water abstraction for irrigation, it's caused almost half of recent sea level rise on the planet. And as this figure shows for the world's birds, but you could construct it for other creatures, it's by far the biggest source of threat to biological diversity, especially in developing countries. That's where we are already, but our population is set to rise to 9 or 10 billion over the next half century to century. And we know that on a per capita basis, people consistently demand more calories in their diet and, crucially, more protein as they get wealthier. Based on that, it's clear that demand for food is going to rise enormously over the next half century. Even if we're going to be able to do a great deal about food waste, which we absolutely must, even if we can do something about the rise of meat eating as people get wealthier, even if we can do those things, it seems certain that global food demand is going to rise dramatically. So how can we meet that demand at least cost to other species? Well, broadly speaking, a couple of divergent solutions have been put forward. There are others, but two extremes I'm going to talk about, focus on today. The approach most commonly advocated by the conservation community, the community I belong to, can be labelled land sharing. And it stems in large part from the realization from Rachel Carson and many others since that industrial farming lowers biodiversity on farms. As an antidote to that, land sharing argues for retaining on-farm habitat features, things like hedgerows and small ponds, and reducing the input of chemicals. And it's an approach that's received widespread political support in the European Union, for example, but it also typically lowers yields, by which I mean production per unit area. And we know it does on average, because otherwise we wouldn't have to pay farmers to adopt it. The fact we have to pay them to do it tells us that it's lowering their yields. And that recognition of a trade-off between farm yield and on-farm biodiversity has in turn prompted the very different idea of land sparing. If sharing lowers yields, then to produce the same amount of food, we need more land under farming, leaving less land for natural, unfarmed habitats. So perhaps instead we should increase yields on existing farmland, but combine that with sparing or even restoring intact habitat elsewhere. So just to run over that idea, in these cartoon landscapes, where the black cells are intact habitat and then the grey through white cells show land being farmed at increasingly high yield, the left-hand landscape is a land-sharing landscape. It's got wildlife-friendly but low-yield farming. And then over on the far right, there's a land-sparing landscape where farm yields are very much higher and farmland itself is correspondingly less wildlife-friendly. But for the same total amount of production from the landscape, we can have more area under intact habitat. And of course, we can imagine intermediate scenarios too. What might be best for biodiversity depends, it turns out, on how the population density of each species, each creature in the area, responds to increasing yield. So how each species' population density changes as we move from left to right, from zero yielding intact habitat through low yield farmland, eventually to the highest yield farming that we can get in our region. For a few species, these responses, things we call density yield curves, they will have positive slopes. That means they're winner species. These are species that benefit from farming. They're going to do well as we want to farm more. So as conservationists, we don't really need to worry too much about the winner species in the landscape. Loser species, on the other hand, will have negative sloping density yield curves. And which approach to farming is least bad for them? They're all bad, but which one is least bad for them depends on the exact shape of those responses, the shape of those curves. Loser species which have this kind of shape curve in the dark blue, they're relatively insensitive to low yield farming. And that means they do least badly under a land sharing world. On the other hand, we can think of loser species with this shape curve in dark red. They depend so much on intact habitat that they do least badly under land sparing, because only land sparing can safeguard enough of that intact habitat that they absolutely rely upon. And then you can imagine species with more complex density yield curves like this one in purple, which may do least badly under intermediate yields, under some intermediate solution. What matters then is the overall frequency of these different curve types among all the species we're concerned with. So what we need to do is move on from some theory to collecting some data. I'll show you a bit of data. Here's our group's results for Ghanaian birds, so birds living in a forested landscape, what was originally a forested landscape in southern Ghana. Exactly which approach for farming is best for a given species depends on how much food we want to produce from a region. So here, what I'm doing in this chart is plotting out the frequency of those species preferences, shown by the same colors that I used before, as production increases in our region from left to right across that chart. And if you focus on current day production levels, so that left-hand vertical line, you can see that some species in paler colors, those are the winners. They're going to do better from farming than in its absence. But the majority of species are in dark colors. Those are the losers. And most of those loser species in dark red have got those density yield responses that mean that they would do least badly under a land-sparing world. There are a few there in dark blue and purple that would do least badly under land sharing or under intermediate yield farming. But those tend to switch to preferring land sparing. The dark blue and the dark purple become red as we move from left to right across the chart. So as demand for food production increases, which it doubtless will into the future in this part of Ghana. So those are the results for Ghanaian birds. In fact, they're for wide-ranging Ghanaian bird species, ones which have large global distributions. But this result, this predominance of red in that chart, is much more striking for Ghanaian bird species with narrow global ranges. These are the ones that are only found in this part of the world. They're the species that as conservationists we tend to be most concerned about, and where decisions in Ghana are going to have the greatest effect on the persistence of these species into the future. Importantly, we've repeated this work for many different parts of the world, many different sorts of creatures. So we've done it for trees, for grasses, for sedges, for daisy relatives, plants in the family Asteraceae, for butterflies, and for dung beetles. And as well as doing it in Ghana, we've done this work in India, in Uganda, in the Pampas, in Kazakhstan, and most recently in Mexico and in Poland. And remarkably, we get very similar results in every region and for each group that we've looked at, with most species being losers from farming and most losers preferring land sparing over land sharing or any intermediate approach, with that pattern becoming more pronounced as demand increases and if we focus on species of particular conservation concern. So what can we say from that? Well, first, importantly, we've just looked at food production. We've not looked at the vitally important job of reducing demand through cutting waste or addressing diets. We've not looked at wider issues around food security. But for the food production part of the puzzle, we can say for those places and groups that we've looked at, most species are losers, most of which would do least badly under high-yield farming, provided that is indeed linked to sparing remaining habitats for nature. There's still lots we want to do. We want to extend the geographic and taxonomic reach of our density yield analyses. We want to test some less simplistic models, and we need to look at other outcomes of land use, such as greenhouse gas emissions. Although we've done some work on carbon fluxes, which again points in the direction of land sparing being the least bad way forward to limit emissions associated with farming. Most importantly, we don't have all of the tools we need to implement land sparing. We need, as a conservation community, I think, to work with agricultural scientists and others to identify and encourage techniques that can increase yields at low environmental cost. So land sparing in this world certainly isn't about intensive farming business as usual. It's about finding smart ways to boost yields sustainably. And we need to look for practical ways of explicitly coupling high yield growth with land sparing. If left to market forces alone, we know that high yields won't safeguard natural habitats. We need explicit policy and market mechanisms to do that. We might get a chance perhaps to talk about that, the policy side of things later on, but from the biological point of view, my conclusion is that land sparing is probably the least bad approach to reconciling farming and food production in theory. And for me, the question is now becoming, how can we deliver it in practice? Thank you very much.